This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of Moonlight Mile by jennandblitz, composed by Burning Aurora.
Mooney, come to bed.
Sirius calls from where he's sitting cross-legged against the headboard, knitted blanket pooling overtop the sheets. The light on the nightstand is dim, but still bright enough for him to read by, as far as the more modern books go, because ink and parchment are torture in low light. At least now he's given in to James's insistence to wear his glasses. Out in the living room of their cottage, Sirius can hear Comet snoring, her slow rhythmic breaths that peak every so often when she chases something particularly exciting in her dreams. Comet is Remus's dog, in truth, because the spaniel is glued to his side and ignores every command Sirius gives her, even if Sirius is the so-called animal whisperer. He can also hear the soft click-click of a needle or scissors, just barely over the purring of the large tomcat on his legs, or the decidedly less elegant snores of the Staffordshire Terrier sleeping against his side. Sirius can't resist rescuing a stray. He always jokes he's one himself, and Remus only encourages their growing menagerie.
I will.
Remus replies, his voice a little hoarse and quiet, having not spoken for a while.
Just finishing this blanket, seeing as someone doesn't like seaming.
Sirius tuts softly, turns the next page of his book, and pets absently at the velvety fur beside him.
Knew you didn't like seaming, Lancelot.
He murmurs conspiratorially to the staffy, who doesn't stir at all. Salem lifts his head from Sirius's legs, though, yellow eyes wide and inquisitive.
You just like chasing the yarn, darling, I know.
When he doesn't hear anything else from the living room, besides Comet's snoring and the jangle of one of the other cats chasing a toy across the hardwood floor, Sirius pauses, looking up from his book.
Babe, the moon is in 2 days. You need your rest.
Maybe you should finish your knitting projects then, Padfoot.
Remus says, the teasing note clear in his voice despite the tiredness. Sirius can clearly picture the bemused expression on his face, with that hint of mischief that Sirius adores. Sirius shares an exasperated look with Salem, who is probably just wondering why his human cushion is talking.
You know there's a spell for that. You can set it seaming, and it'll be done tomorrow, like magic.
Predictably, Remus lets out an indignant squawk, and a moment later he appears in the doorway. His own glasses are on his nose, the silver of his curls backlit so beautifully that Sirius's heart swoops in his chest like some star chaser. 42 has never looked more attractive than Remus Lupin.
You know magic ruins knitting? Tell me you haven't, have you? I know Molly does it, but still.
Merlin, he's far too adorable for Sirius to handle at this time of night. He tries to hide his smile, but he can't lie to Remus.
I haven't, babe. Don't worry. I wouldn't do that to your mum. She'd haunt me.
Remus snickers, his crooked little smile widening.
She would.
He agrees, then leans against the doorframe. Sirius wonders briefly what he'll have to do to get the man in bed. For once, not for sordid reasons.
You look comfy. Is there even room in there for me?
Always.
Sirius scoffs.
Come to bed.
The blanket.
I'll finish it in the morning, before you even wake up, all right?
Sirius smiles, watching the prospect of that crawling over Remus's face. He draws the edge of the covers back to bare the space there for Remus, tempting him further.
I'll make a big pot of tea, too. Walk the dogs.
Remus groans, then waves his hand behind him.
Fine, you've convinced me.
He grumbles as the lights in the living room turn off and the static buzz of the record player disappears. The only noise now are the snores of the dogs and the chirping of the bats that live in the roof.
Oh, I had to really twist your arm, huh?
Sirius lets his book fall closed and smiles at Remus. After all, the new legislation can get another proofread after the moon, and he has already owled the new flyers to the printers this afternoon. The other man shrugs out of his cardigan, kicks his jeans away, and swaps them for the brushed flannel pajamas Lily had gotten him for his birthday just gone. She gave Sirius a pair too, but he refuses to wear them at the same time as Remus. Matching outfits is a step too far. Comet brushes past Remus as he's about to climb into bed. She gives him a lick on the cheek, even as he admonishes her, and she snuggles up with Lancelot instead of stealing his space. Sirius chuckles as he floats his book onto the pile on the floor. Comet really did only listen to Remus, and Sirius couldn't blame her.
Oh, hush, you know I can't resist a cuddle in bed with you.
Remus retorts, snuggling down amongst the blankets. It's May, but there's still frost on the grass in the morning in the middle of the Scottish Highlands, so they can never have too many blankets. Nor furry, cuddly animals, it seems. Sirius wraps his arms around Remus's shoulders, kisses his temple, then the corner of his mouth, where the graying stubble scratches his lip.
And I know just how to tempt you. Tea, the prospect of a lie-in.
And you could convince me just with you.
Remus's voice is already sleepy. He has always been able to turn off in a heartbeat, snoring as soon as his head hits the pillow. The tone of his voice and those saccharine words make Sirius ache again with adoration.
Night, you charmer.
Sirius says, smiling as he flutters his fingers to set the lamp to slowly dim and feels Remus relax against him.
Night, love you.
Sirius does get up the next morning, slipping out of bed to leave Remus curled up with the cats, barely stirring. For the longest time, before the war and just after, Sirius didn't have anything close to a routine, or any semblance of normality. War had been terrifying, of course, for all of them, and those few years had taken their toll beyond anything else. It had been worth it. It still was, Sirius thinks as his knees creak and shift as he gets dressed and wraps up warm. It would still be worth it to go through it all to end up here. So Sirius craves his routine, loves every moment of his domestic normality as he puts on 2 pairs of wool socks and his long down coat. It didn't fall into place quickly, of course. It took years. After Halloween 1981, the cottage and Godric's blown to smithereens, Lily and James huddled with Harry, Sirius and Remus breathing hard, bloody but alive, calling for Kingsley and a healer. Dumbledore graced them all with his presence in the smoking wreckage of the house, and Remus pulled Sirius away from hexing their old headmaster, or something even more impulsive. Now, stoking the fire with a few more logs and topping up the food and water for the animals seems about as far away from yelling at Dumbledore until he's hoarse about how James and Lily and Harry are more important than any research, and that they aren't his pawns, and Sirius can feel his blood pressure rising. His mind healer telling him in his head to breathe, to let this go and float out into the ether. The Potters are safe, happy, perfect. Sirius whistles as he steps out of the cottage and closes the door behind him when the dogs join him. Comet, Lancelot, Gracie the spaniel who is too smart for her own good, Circe, a Sheltie who turned up at their door one day, soaked to the bone and terrified. They've been in this routine for long enough that the dogs know which way to go, and Sirius can stroll behind them with a lead over his shoulder just in case. It's misty this morning, still foggy, and the grass crunches under his feet. For a long time Sirius was uncomfortable with silence, with being alone with his own thoughts, but now he is at peace with them, enjoying the quiet as he walks along. The Muirs span out forever, and he knows from experience that not many others will be out at this time. So when his soul feels quiet enough, at the top of one roving valley, Sirius can take a deep breath and let Padfoot come forth. It's like nothing else, feeling the frosty grass beneath 4 paws, running and free. Every so often someone will ask at the meetings just before the moon or just after, what it feels like. Is it like a lycanthrope transformation? Like a risky human transfiguration? Like dreaming? It's not. It's nowhere near the same. But that's why they do this, isn't it? That's why they do it all, for each other, for everyone who needs it. The dogs are thrilled to play with Padfoot like they always are, late at night in the garden or out on the muirs like this. Padfoot isn't allowed in the cottage, not after he and Atlas, the Australian shepherd they'd rescued a few years ago, had broken a vase, 2 pairs of glasses, and a photo frame.
All right.
Sirius says as he shifts back into his 2-legged form and brushes mud from his jeans, sitting on the edge of an old, dilapidated wall, probably older than Hogwarts. The dogs bound around him as he digs in his coat pocket to pull out the little hand mirror he's never far away from, even now when Voldemort has been gone for nearly 2 decades.
Let Pads catch his breath. I'm not as spry as you lot.
He adds with a chuckle, unfolding the cover of the mirror so he can whistle to it and rap on the surface with 1 knuckle. James appears in the reflection a few moments later. Godric, he looks more and more like Fleamont every bloody day.
Morning.
He chirps, then takes a big gulp of his coffee. James during term time is always happy to have his ear talked off, never mind how imminent the moon is. The younger kids are at Hogwarts, and so is Lily. She makes a great potions master, much better than old Slughorn, as absurd as he was. And Harry is off learning and exploring, being a young adult without the heavy mantle of being a Potter, the family that saved the world.
Morning. Surprised you're awake so early.
Sirius snickers, standing back up again, strolling to keep warm. James flips him off, and he takes another gulp of his coffee.
I sent the new flyers to the printers yesterday. Did you get a chance to look at the legislation? I fell asleep to it last night.
You're getting on, old boy.
James teases. The 4 months between them has always been a joke, whether Sirius is the old man or James is the youngster.
Yeah, I had a look at some after I came back from seeing Lil's. I have a few suggestions, but we're in no rush to get back to Kingsley.
Sirius starts back towards the cottage, whistling absently again to call the dogs, though they're all on his heels anyway.
I know, but you know the Wizengamot is going to push back on some of it, especially if Albus has any say in it. If he asks Mooney to do any more outreach to packs in the middle of Siberia, I'm going to hex his nose off.
Me too, we'll sort it.
They will. Sirius knows that, because they have a routine now, they have it all figured out, and Merlin knows the wider view on lycanthropy is much, much better than it used to be even 10 years ago. They have worked hard, Sirius, Remus, and James, to make it so. The world is better for it. The wizarding world and everyone else who might be undereducated or wary and frightened. Most importantly, they do this for the people who need it. Those terrified and lonely people with bites that haunt them for the rest of their lives. So they know that this isn't their fault. By now, the day of the full moon is full of things to do, people to see, preparations to enact. Remus, ever the stubborn little git, is in the barn with Sirius, setting out blankets and cushions on the poured concrete floor. He has, thankfully, realized that Sirius should be the one who scales the ladder into the hayloft to secure and sort the bookcase they had transfigured into storage spaces for those due to arrive later. Sirius can hear Remus shuffling about below, humming softly as he makes the barn as homely and habitable as possible. Sirius can't help but smile at their domesticity. It will never tire him, he's sure, marveling at the idea that he and Mooney are in a little cottage, home, moving around each other and coexisting with such ease that he can feel his 19-year-old self laughing in disbelief.
Sure you don't need a hand up there?
Remus asks after a moment of quiet. Sirius hears the rungs of the ladder squeak under protest, and he strides to the edge of the hayloft, intending to give the man a stern look. True enough, he's on the first rung of the ladder and looking up at Sirius expectantly. The full moon always makes Sirius nostalgic. Sometimes it's less than positive, those wartime moons where he didn't know where Remus was, didn't know whether he would come back. Sometimes, though, he thinks of Lily's early wolfsbane bruise and waking in the yellowish morning light to see Remus curled up next to him, unharmed and open, kissing him awake and saying it worked, my love.
Remus, don't you dare.
Sirius hurries out, hands on his hips.
You need to rest, and besides, it's done up here.
He pulls his wand from his pocket, sending a tidy flick towards the bookcases to open the rest of the little cubbies. Remus laughs, but when Sirius glances down again, he thankfully has both feet on the floor.
All right, put your hackles down.
Descending the ladder, Sirius makes a note to reinforce some of the warming charms on the barn, despite the fact that most inhabitants will be fur-covered shortly. There's no reason for them to be cold, after all. Remus is smiling softly at him, the weary stoop of his shoulders only making Sirius think of how many moons they have had together and how many more they will have.
Hi.
Sirius murmurs, closing the gap between them with a short stride. Remus chuckles, meets him easily and eagerly as Sirius cups his flushed cheek and kisses him softly.
Have I mentioned you look utterly gorgeous today?
With my too tired to shave beard and my puffy pre-moon joints.
He asks in retort, turning to press his lips to Sirius's palm, nip the heel of it, and grin wider. It's not that Sirius doesn't notice these things, or is utterly oblivious of them growing old, but he's eager to see it, catalogues every new gray hair or wrinkle, and treasures it like a goal he'd never thought to reach for.
Always, babe.
Sirius kisses him again, lingering close as he brushes his thumb over the cold-flushed pink of Remus's cheek.
You know I never wanted to grow old unless it was with you.
Remus hums, his brow crinkling together, his eyes turning a little misty.
I know. I didn't think I would without you.
No matter whether Sirius believes it or not, he knows Remus is right. They made a pact that November, bruised and bloodied on Sirius's 21st birthday, to never lie to each other. So, when Remus says I wouldn't grow old without you, Sirius knows it's true. He smiles wryly, one corner of his mouth plucking up.
You might have held off going grey for a few years without me, I reckon.
That earns a laugh from Remus, a proper one, where his eyes crinkle at the corners and that crooked canine peeks over the edge of his lip as he shakes his head. His eyes are such a golden brown. Sirius thinks he doesn't need the sun.
Oh, maybe. By that measure, shouldn't you be white-haired?
He asks then, bringing his free hand from Sirius's arm up to card his fingers through the gray at his temples. Sirius leans into him, smiling. How many times have they had this conversation? No matter, they'll have it 100 times more because Sirius will never tire of this. He kisses Remus again, counting every kiss they'll have from here to eternity. Slow, gentle, early morning ones, sharp, stubborn post-argument ones, frighteningly desperate ones in mid-nightmare terror, moan-filled ones with Remus bracketed between Sirius's arms, hungry in the waxing moonlight, satisfied ones, after. Every single kiss, Sirius thinks, nipping gently at Remus's lower lip and smiling wider when the man gives a wonderful noise in response.
All right. Are we nearly ready? Oh, for Merlin's sake.
James's voice comes from the doorway, and Sirius can't help the laugh that bubbles out of his lips as Remus breaks their kiss and presses his forehead into Sirius's shoulder to stifle his own chuckles.
We're busy, Prongs.
Sirius mutters, only half joking as Remus gives him a mischievous look from beneath those silver-stranded curls. He presses a kiss to Sirius's shoulder through his jumper, then nudges the neckline of it aside to kiss the bare skin and make Sirius tingle all over.
Mooney, put him down!
James cries, just as Remus scrapes his teeth over the sensitive angle of Sirius's shoulder he knows so well. Sirius is sure the motion is betrayed by his facial expression, even if James hadn't caught them snogging more times than they can count.
You're both as bad as each other.
I take offense to that, Prongs.
Remus murmurs, still weaving his playful path of kisses down Sirius's neck. By now, Sirius is sure this is another of their routines. The waxing moon gives Remus some kind of energy, as if it's gathering for the transformation, pulling him along with it. And James has caught them in this barn, in various states of undress, just as many times as they have had the moons together. Tomorrow will be a different matter, of course, that energy ebbing away and leaving a man behind in its wake, but that's tomorrow. One day at a time, Sirius tells himself. Sirius enjoys the look of hilarious indignation on James's face for a moment longer, before he wraps his arms around Remus's waist, tugs him away just a little.
Fine, if Prongs is a spoilsport.
He tells Remus, grinning wider when James throws up a hand and lets out some kind of squawk.
Let's get to work.
Most of the attendees arrive by mid-afternoon, apparating to the alder tree 100 feet or so from the cottage. Some, the younger ones and their guardians, arrived from St. Mungo's through a port key James had set up years ago for just that. Their cottage had been a happy accident, finding it here one post-moon morning and falling in love. It helped immensely that the little building was isolated, with plenty of land and a barn to hold their meetings. It was important to them both to have a place of safety, and there it was. Remus sits on one of the sofas in the barn, perched on the edge because he's tired and wired all at once, filled with an achy energy that will come to fruition in a few hours. Sirius sits on the arm of the sofa, his arm around Remus, protective and supportive like always.
Evening, everyone.
Remus says, clearing his throat as the gentle conversation falls to quiet around them. There are around 20 people sitting on sofas or cushions, lying on the floor to study the ceiling as they listen. 20 feels like an achievement. To know 20 people who have lycanthropy can find safety and understanding here, to learn and discover, to have support and love. Sirius remembers the first meeting they had decided to hold, in a tiny room at the back of the leaky cauldron. He had about keeled over when 3 people turned up.
We have a few new members here today. This is Lavender, and this is Alessio.
Remus pauses for the chorus of greetings. Sirius follows his gestures to the new attendees, a woman with a frightened expression and a man eyeing everyone else warily. Sirius doesn't blame either of them. He can't imagine how terrifying this is.
So welcome. Please make yourself at home. Put anything you want to keep safe, wands, clothes, anything like that, up in the hayloft. Anyone who hasn't eaten and wishes to, there's plenty of food in the house we can bring through. But please do stay in here from now onwards. Moonrise is sometimes a little tricky.
Remus earns a chuckle or two then from the more relaxed members. Sirius has been watching Alessio whilst he talks. Perhaps it's his protective streak rearing its ugly head at this time of the month, but Sirius can practically see the fearful aggression radiating from the man. But after a moment, perhaps when he realizes this isn't some elaborate trick to hurt him, his shoulders seem to relax, that furrow in his brow easing just a little. Sirius watches, just in case, surveying the people who have gathered here with them. He can remember how every one of them arrived here over the past few years. Ruth, who was 12 when she first turned up, with her mother looking just as frightened. Andrea, her mother, would sit in the cottage through the night, waiting until the morning when Sirius or James would ease the wards from the front door and beckon those waiting loved ones back to the barn. Ruth is a successful young woman now. She designs wizarding in Muggle fashion that's being shown all over the world. She still looks at Remus like the uncle who took her under his wing every full moon. There is Apollon, a man in his early 20s, whose twin sister Artemis sits in the cottage tonight, as she does every moon to chastise her brother whilst healing his wounds the next morning. They have been here for several years, and every so often talk about setting up something similar themselves. They spend a lot of time in northern Italy with their mother, and Remus will light up with excitement at the idea of his legacy spreading further and further to help more and more people who need it. Molly's eldest is here too, Bill. Ever since that failed uprising of Voldemort's supporters a few years ago, spearheaded by idiots Sirius won't even name, his vicious little voice says, cutting through the soothing balm of his mind healer and all their hard work, Bill had contracted lycanthropy. Thankfully, Molly had more sense than her elder brothers combined and came right to Remus for help. As Remus explains the procedure for tonight, reiterating that James, a trained healer, yes, James Potter, the actual James Potter, will be here for any emergency help, and that the grounds are safe and secure, as is the cottage. Sirius can't help but indulge his nostalgia, remembering how every one of these moons have gone so far, how much they have achieved. It's not just those who come to the cottage for the full moon, for a safe place, a pack to run with, a good hot meal, empathy and respect, who they have helped. Moonlight Mile, after Sirius's favorite Rolling Stones song, of course, and he can never resist an awfully punny tagline, "We go the extra mile," campaigned for the Lycanthropy Act, removing werewolves from the classifications of dangerous creatures in wizarding Britain, and giving them all the rights to a normal life they deserve. Remus has done some outreach to other, more feral packs, but thankfully Dumbledore seems to have dropped that idea. Perhaps wild packs like those are becoming rarer and rarer. A pack had disbanded in Norway a few years ago. Sirius and Remus took in 2/3 of them, turned the barn into some kind of dormitory to help them back onto their feet and into society, if that was what they wished. There are healers trained to deal with lycanthropy patients now, and far more accessible information at St. Mungo's for anyone newly afflicted, as well as acceptance, compassion, and care, as much as that should be a given. Right now, they're pushing for a more accessible wolfsbane plan. True enough, James took early retirement from a successful healer position to run the company full-time, and Sirius has always been a layabout, according to James. The two of them have enough money to fund wolfsbane for all those who need it, but that's hardly the point. Care should be accessible for them all, regardless of two philanthropists and their little lycanthropy soapbox. Lily brews the wolfsbane at Hogwarts, and James distributes it around for that week before the moon. Remus, of course, is the one at the forefront of it all. He's the one campaigning, going in front of Kingsley and putting his foot down. He'd been the one to force the ban on teaching of werewolves in Hogwarts, beyond how to help them, of course. He's been the one at the bedside of someone newly afflicted, bone-tired from his own transformation, and yet armed with leaflets and information for their loved ones. Sirius has been with him every step of the way, cheering him on at every moment. Remus has always been a stubborn man, always done things out of a stubborn spite, which is entirely different to Sirius's sharp, fiery spite. And it didn't surprise Sirius that, once the war ended, Remus decided to turn that stubborn, self-deprecating bit of himself inside out. Sirius can remember it clearly, the 20th anniversary of his bite. He and Remus getting drunk and burning his old copy of Fantastic Beasts. Sirius had kept his, with graffiti from he and James declaring werewolves to be cute and cuddly, and can be sated with shepherd's pie and caramel chocolate. They hadn't slept that night, Remus fueled by his righteous indignation, so the next day he strode into the ministry as soon as the public doors were open and demanded a meeting with the minister. Perhaps it was seeing everything settle after the war that spurred him into action, seeing the Potters safe, sound, and healthy, seeing those who had wrongly supported Voldemort repenting and being forgiven. That had spurred Sirius too. He had been floating after the war, he and Remus dancing around each other like lovesick teenagers wondering who would ask whom to the dance first. That had been the night, Remus's 20th anniversary, when Sirius had looked across the fiery remnants of that burned textbook and said, "I love you, you know. Be mine."
Any last questions before I hand you over to Padfoot and Prongs?
Remus asks. His voice has taken on that reedy sort of quality he gets before moonrise, the impending ache of his bones. Sirius rubs his shoulder gently, kneading at the tightness. Remus leans into him, taking solace in his touch, judging by the way his brow lifts just a little. Right on cue, James slips into the barn, and Sirius feels the throb of magic as he reinforces the charms there. He has been in the cottage, making sure the fire is stoked for the night, that those who are inside, sleeping or holding a tired vigil for their loved ones, are safe and have everything they need. James gives Sirius a decisive nod, then waves a quick hello to Ruth, who has spotted his arrival. Lavender pipes up, clears her throat, and her own voice is reedy with the coming hours.
"We're not going to hurt you, are we?"
Lavender looks at Sirius with wide brown eyes, then whips her head around to look at her colleagues.
I thought werewolves hunted humans."
Oh,
Remus looks puzzled for a moment, until a dry little chuckle escapes from his lips.
well, yes, the lycanthropy transformation takes away our ability to distinguish friend from foe.
He starts, and Sirius knows he chooses his words carefully. They are not werewolves. They don't hunt.
But Padfoot and Prongs, Sirius my partner, and James our dear friend are anime guy, so they are able to help and accompany us tonight.
Lavender sighs in relief, her shoulders falling a little as she nods. Apollon leans over and gently rubs her shoulder, murmuring something reassuring, no doubt.
What he's not saying.
Ruth says with a sly smile on her face that reminds Sirius of Harry when he was younger, and of his younger self with James and Remus beside him.
Is that Padfoot and Prongs became anime guy to help Remus, to keep him company when they were teenagers.
Uncle Fab says you lot got into all sorts of trouble.
Bill grins as a chorus of awe and other niceties go through the gathered crowd. Sirius snickers, leaning over to drop a kiss atop Remus's curls. Remus gives him a sappy smile in return, uncaring of everything around them for a moment. James has skirted through the throngs of people to sit in an empty seat next to Ruth. He looks like Fleamont, and his 15-year-old self all at once, with his salt and pepper hair and his ludicrous smile.
The worst of trouble, really. Kept Minnie on her toes. But we're here to help everyone. Make this as easy as possible for you all.
Soon enough, the wristwatch just beneath the cuff of Remus's jumper vibrates tidily, indicating true sunset. It's just as routine as everything else for Remus to slip the watch off and hand it to Sirius along with his wand and the gold band that would serve as a wedding ring if they were actually married. Sirius pockets them as everyone else sets aside their important things, then presses a kiss to Remus's mouth to wait for the inevitable. As routine as it has become, it's no less painful for Sirius to watch Remus writhe in pain, his breathing short and sharp. He no longer fights it like he did when they were teens, as content as he can be to let Mooney take over for the night. Sirius stays in his two-legged form as long as possible, with his arm tight around Remus's shoulders, stroking his back until he feels fur sprout from the follicles. hears the breath in his lover's throat turn to a growl. Then Padfoot barges his way forward, and the night turns into a blur of tussling and barking, searching for muddy puddles to roll in and falling asleep just before dawn with a snout buried in gray-brown fur. In the dawn light after the moon, there is very little that can draw Sirius away from his lover. He had shifted back to his two-legged, graying hair and crow's feet self only a second or two after the others had fallen into their exhausted sleep. He's tired, of course, even as he sits up beside Remus and sees James stir from his place near the barn door.
All right, Prongs.
Sirius croaks, keeping his voice low enough not to disturb the man beside him. In fact, he threads his fingers carefully through Remus's hair, pleased to see it's not too matted in mud or mulch. No one else will stir for a while, if their usual mornings are anything to go by, so Sirius is in no hurry.
Yeah, good.
James says around a yawn, and Sirius glances back up to see him stretching onto his toes. He has a few leaves in his hair, but shakes them out with a little chuckle. There's a streak of mud on his cheek, but Sirius hasn't the heart to tell him as James pins him with an earnest look.
You. Scratch his cuts.
Sirius rubs his hands down his arms, purposefully checking before he gives James a smile.
Nah, unscathed tonight, even if Alessia wanted to tussle.
He murmurs, standing up himself and pulling his wand from his pocket. Magic is a natural thing for him, something braided into his veins. He knows Remus treasures magic in the moments after the transformation. It reminds him he's a wizard, as it seems to seat him back into himself. For now, Sirius lights the lanterns they have in the barn, low and gentle light, then sets a blanket over every sleeping person on the floor or curled into the old sofas. Sirius will never forget visiting a ministry-approved facility for lycanthropy sufferers, the morning after with Remus unsteady next to him, seeing these people naked on the floor, held tight in what amounted to cages. Thinking of it now makes him furious, so he always makes this his first priority. Dignity will always be his priority.
Surprised you kept up, old boy.
James quips, snickering as he helps Sirius. He moves from person to person, making sure they are healthy and are in no immediate need of help. They both move slowly, methodically, comfortable and quiet in their routine. Sirius scoffs, flips him off as he pauses by Remus, bends down to smooth the curls from his face. James chuckles as he brushes his hands off on the front of his trousers.
I'll go make tea, check in at the cottage,
He announces. They have had the same routine for years at this point. Wake up, check in, James goes to the cottage while Sirius sits with Remus and the others, but James tells him anyway.
Say hi to Lily.
That's another routine. James Flew calls Lily in the cottage fireplace to her room at Hogwarts, where she has been waiting to hear they are all okay. Sirius settles on the floor beside Remus, with his back propped against a sofa, and gently, carefully maneuvers Remus's head to his lap. He's glad to see Remus is largely unharmed, resting his head against Sirius's thigh. He remembers at first, when Remus would come awake at the tiniest movement, always on edge, but now he trusts Sirius, relaxed and pliant, as Sirius lifts one of his arms, carefully spells the mud from beneath his fingernails. Remus's breath is slow and rhythmic, Sirius tending to any little scratches or streaks of dirt as the rest of the world slowly comes awake. Remus's fair lashes flicker as he wakes, his brow creasing momentarily. When his eyes open, though, that little crease disappears, and his chapped lips curve into a smile.
Hi, Pad.
He croaks, turning to press his cheek into Sirius's thigh.
Everyone okay?
Everyone is fine, babe.
Sirius soothes, stroking his fingers through Remus's curls. It's always the first question Remus asks when he wakes. Even that particular time etched in Sirius's memory, where Remus came awake to both Sirius and James trying to stem the bleeding of a deep gash on his thigh, dangerously close to ruin. Sirius will remember James's frown and his shaky fingers around his wand for a long time. But even then, when Remus had awoken full of sharp pain, he had said everyone okay. So now, as he's still waking, testing his limbs and coming back to this two-legged body, Sirius tells him what they did last night. Remus has a ritual when he wakes. He still has 2 legs, 2 arms, 10 fingers, 10 toes, nose, both eyes. Still, nearer to 50 than 15, he catalogs these things. As he does it, Sirius talks, soothing words and soothing passes of his fingers through curls.
Lavender and Alessio did well. Nervous, Padfoot could tell, but they did well. Ruth seemed to stay with Lavender, and Padfoot and Apollon kept Alessio busy. Lots of tussling.
Sirius doesn't linger on that too much, else Remus will fret over the negligible scratches on Sirius's limbs.
Some naps in the barn, and then we ran down to the little lake at the bottom of the valley. It had thawed out for the first time since last year.
Remus's eyes are half closed again, listening to Sirius.
That's why my hair is wet.
He mutters dryly, his smile broader. Sirius sends a gentle drying charm to his hair, and Remus hums, his eyes open, looking up at Sirius full of warmth and love.
Thank you, my love.
Always.
Everyone begins to stir around them. They are safe here. No waking suddenly in cold, hard cells. No clinging to consciousness after the animal affliction has taken its toll on their bodies. It's part of the dignity Remus, and Sirius by extension, holds so dear. Why is it that any other magical affliction is treated with respect, given time and space to recover and rest, when lycanthropy sufferers must live like the animals they are deemed to be? Remus stays with his cheek pressed against Sirius's thigh, even as everyone begins to stir. Perhaps the wizarding world is a little more accepting of queers than the Muggle world, and even more so now than in the 1970s. But back then, in 1970s London, it was always a little more difficult, barring those outings to Earl's Court. Beyond even the fact that Sirius loves Remus, and Remus loves Sirius, Sirius has to admit physical affection like this has a vulnerability to it. Remus has always struggled with vulnerability, having to hide huge swathes of himself and tamp it further and further down. He had no problem nuzzling up next to Sirius, pressing his face into the crook of Sirius's neck and letting Sirius wrap him up. But when anyone saw them, he would shrink away, straighten up, and give Sirius an apologetic little smile, pillow creases across his cheek. Now, though, he has no shame in staying cuddled up to Sirius, letting him soothe his aches and pains. There is a strength in vulnerability, and Remus is the strongest person Sirius knows. Eventually, Remus props himself up against the sofa, then Sirius helps him up to sit there with a blanket wrapped around him, his back against Sirius's chest, so Sirius can feel his sturdy heartbeat.
Tonight, we can have that stew, and I'll take the dogs out this afternoon. Listen to Hunky Dory. You can have a bath.
Sirius murmurs, propping his chin carefully on Remus's shoulder. He's all lax and pliant in Sirius's arms, relaxed and sleepy, soothed and finally released by the moon thrall he has been slave to for the past week or so. The waning moon brings pain and exhaustion, but it is the release of that building tension, relief in some ways. Remus hums, licking his lips quickly before he speaks.
Sounds perfect.
Hush, wait, darling.
Sirius tells Gracie as she presses her chin against his leg, her puppy dog eyes perfectly pleading. Sirius stands at the wooden kitchen counter, dishing out dog food. Gracie is the smartest one of them all, and she knows it as she gives a little whimper.
Oh, fine.
He whispers, holding a chunk of carrot out to her. She takes it gently, then seems content to chomp away at it as Sirius finishes their food.
Just don't tell Mooney.
Remus says the dogs eat better than they do sometimes, but they are strays, and Sirius can't help it. They deserve good food just as much as anyone else. Even Comet has torn herself away from Remus's lap, where she's usually glued the day after the moon. For her dinner, wagging her tail so ferociously, she's wagging her whole body instead. In the living room, Remus sits on the sofa wrapped in another warming charmed blanket. True to their word, Hunky Dory sits on the turntable in the corner, Sirius humming along to Cooks. Remus will hopefully be dozing, catching up on his sleep before they eat the last portion of the stew they'd cooked for the previous night. Then Sirius will help him into the tub and sit on that stool they have in the bathroom for just that reason, running damp fingers through his hair. Sirius sets down all 4 of the bowls for the dogs, who all wait for their command, and that makes Sirius proud of this motley crew of mutts, including himself. He straightens up with a little grunt that doesn't make him feel old and watches them with a smile.
Don't tell me what.
Remus's voice comes from the doorway. He has that sly, mischievous smile on his lips, even though he looks bone-tired, and he's standing there for some reason instead of dozing on the sofa like he should.
Aren't you meant to be sleeping?
Sirius retorts, stepping forward to stop Lancelot trying to steal a particularly tasty-looking piece of chicken from Comet. Remus chuckles, leaning against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets. The blanket is still around his shoulders, so Sirius supposes that's a plus.
I was dozing.
Remus answers, but doesn't elaborate further. Sirius knows that look on his face is expectant, waiting for Sirius to answer his first question. Sirius grins and crosses to him, content that the dogs will be too interested in their own food to steal any from their friends. Sirius wraps an arm around Remus's waist, kissing the corner of his lips.
Well,
Remus smiles, his hands going to Sirius's hips.
The more you butter me up, the more I think you've done something heinous. Did you give the dogs our food again?
Sirius snickers, pressing his lips to Remus's jaw again.
so rude. You say that as if I do it all the time.
He continues, giving his partner a sly smile. He knows Remus will melt, and that their little back and forth fuels them both. Remus might look like a stickler for the rules, but he's just as ridiculous as Sirius. He would let Comet get away with murder, tucking herself up at his feet and eating the little pieces of chicken Remus gives her, that he thinks Sirius doesn't notice. But then, there was that time Remus got 2 steaks from the butcher's for a nice romantic meal, and Sirius had given them to the dogs without thinking.
Uh-huh.
I gave Gracie some carrot because she's very clever and deserves it.
Sirius pulls away and leads Remus towards the sofa.
And you, babe, deserve to sit the fuck down and rest up. Okay.
Remus sits on the sofa with the blanket unfurled around him like a regal cloak, his cheeks a little flushed as he smiles up at Sirius. He hooks a foot around Sirius's thigh and pulls him down with a sharp tug.
In that case, I deserve company, love.
Remus says over Sirius's chuckled yelp of surprise as he tumbles onto the sofa next to Remus, twisting a little to avoid falling on him.
Remus.
Sirius laughs as he snuggles up next to him, wrapping his arms around Remus entirely on instinct.
I could have hurt you.
From your massive weight on me,
Remus drawls, then presses his face to Sirius's neck.
as if you don't love me under you any other time.
Sirius can't help tilting his head to let Remus press a little curve of kisses over his shoulder.
This isn't sleeping, babe.
He murmurs, despite leaning into him. Sirius is powerless to stop Remus when he's kissing him so wonderfully. It has taken both Sirius and Remus many years to unlearn those gut reactions they developed during the war. Loud noises or unexpected sounds, strange flares of unknown magic. Now they don't jump at every moment, don't wake up several times a night at a sound they haven't quite encountered before. But Sirius does jump at the ringing of the phone, solely because that thing doesn't ring very often at all. Remus had gotten the thing years ago before Hope died, and they had both figured out a charm to link it to the Flu network. It's also linked up to Sirius's watch, along with that moonrise charm he's most proud of, though this one is a little more temperamental, so it buzzes against his wrist only a moment after the ringing starts. Remus pauses immediately, lifting his head from Sirius's neck.
Expecting anyone?
He murmurs, now going slack against Sirius's side. Sirius frowns and manages to extricate himself from the sofa and Remus. The phone doesn't ring often, and usually it's urgent news, if and when it does ring. So Sirius doesn't dawdle over to it, even as Lancelot gives the thing a soft woof of disapproval for making him jump.
No, not after the moon.
He mutters, then lifts the phone from the cradle and brings it to his ear.
Hello.
Hello, I'm looking for Remus Lupin, or Sirius Black. My name's Hortensia Pringgrape. I'm a head healer at St. Mungo's.
She's a sharp-sounding woman, all business, and her voice makes Sirius panic immediately. Who would be looking for them from St. Mungo's? James is the retired healer. Surely they would call him if they needed Moonlight Mile. Only Sirius knows he's prone to overreaction, to thinking of the worst. Unless it's James who's in trouble, or Lily, or Harry, or Aurora, Henry, Florence.
Yes, Sirius here.
He manages to choke out, drawing a strange look from Remus, who is still sitting on the sofa, but now frowning deeply. He would know if something was wrong with the Potters, surely. In his bones, he would know.
Ah, hello. Mr. Potter asked me to contact you. We've a patient with us, who I think you would be able to help.
Hortensia says, stumbling over her words a little, as if this isn't a script she's rehearsed too thoroughly.
James, he's all right, isn't he?
Sirius leans against the doorframe, his shoulders slumped in relief. His panic had consumed him for a second, as it tends to do, but it is ebbing now. Remus slips off the sofa, or rather, climbs warily, and makes his way over to him. Sirius would have been concerned at the way he holds on to the back of the sofa, or the sideboard where their record player sits on his way, but now he's used to it, reassured by their moon routines. It will ease in a few days, especially with the Murtlap bath.
Oh, yes, he just asked me to speak to you directly.
Hortensia gives a little laugh, uncomfortable. Sirius puffs out his cheeks to Remus, then pulls the phone away from his ear and casts a quick amplification charm so he can hear it too. Hortensia's voice is a little odd through the charm, but it gets the job done.
We have a patient in our ward. She has a, well, if I can be blunt, Mr. Black.
Sirius winces. Mr. Black is his father, but he nods. Remus has a bemused look on his face. Lycanthropy, Remus mouths before he rubs a hand over his stubbled beard.
Yes, please be blunt, Miss Pringrape. Is this about lycanthropy?
Miss Pringrape makes a noise then, something close to relief.
Yes, apologies, it's still something. Well, this child, she appears to have been attacked during the full moon last night. The Aurors found her. Well, I'd like to speak in person. Are you able to visit the hospital, ideally sooner rather than later?
Yes, absolutely.
Sirius's stomach churns. He always thinks of Remus in this position whenever they receive the horrible sinking news of an attack. Remus, at 5 years old, Remus, bloodied with the threat of a wolf beneath his skin. He wants to help however he can. It's their job, but it's their calling too. Their purpose, his and Remus's. But Remus is recovering, and Sirius's priority will always be Remus.
We can come tomorrow morning, first thing.
No, we'll come right away.
Remus interrupts.
Remus Lupin here, sorry.
Sirius frowns, giving Remus a sharp glare.
Mooney.
He hisses, then gives his lover a pointed look up and down. He can barely stand, and he wants to go gallivanting off to St. Mungo's. Remus, the stubborn little bastard he is, gives Sirius an equally pointed look, his chapped lips pressed together in determination.
Oh, hello, Mr. Lupin. Yes, please ask for me at the front desk, and I shall see you there.
Hortensia tells them, apparently a little more at ease with Remus's answer than Sirius's suggestion, even if they are currently staring daggers at each other.
Of course. Thank you, we'll be there.
Remus hurries out. Then as Sirius pulls the phone away to argue against their imminent arrival with Miss Pringrape, Remus reaches over and presses the button on the cradle.
Remus.
Sirius lets the phone fall, the dial tone giving way back to hunky-dory.
We are not going anywhere. You need to rest.
Sirius,
Remus mimics.
she said a child. There is a kid lying in a hospital bed, terrified and bitten.
You need to rest. You're my priority, babe.
Sirius tries then, his hands going to Remus's waist and rubbing gentle crescents over his hip bones. Remus's brown eyes are wide as he looks at Sirius, imploring. He leans into Sirius, and Sirius is reminded of those times they could not be vulnerable with each other, when Remus was as closed off as Sirius, and they knew only what they could show the other. Now they take comfort in vulnerability, as Sirius rubs a hand over Remus's side. There are tears in his eyes.
A kid, Sirius.
He whispers barely a whisper, a breath.
No one was there to help when I woke up, Pads. I want to be the person I needed then.
As if Sirius can refuse that.
All right.
He murmurs, then presses a kiss to Remus's forehead, the bridge of his nose, his lips.
All right, let's go.
Thankfully, it's after visiting hours when they step through the flue at St. Mungo's. The foyer is as close to empty as this place will get, with people minding their own business and getting to it. Remus holds Sirius's arm, steadfast in his refusal for a walking stick after the moon like Sirius tries to insist. He took a pain potion, though, before they stepped through the smoldering grate of their own fireplace, so that's a plus. Sirius is worried about him, or rather, aware of his priorities. He needs to get Remus home and into a Murtlap bath, but he also knows Remus has to do this. So Sirius is by his side as they go to the reception and greet the wizard there. Sirius does most of the talking, with Remus interjecting, and the wizard makes amiable chatter as he checks their system and sends a notification to Healer Pringrape.
Just take the left elevator to the first floor. The stairs are to the left of that, if you like, but the elevator is much quicker.
Thank you.
Sirius tells him with a quick glance to his name tag.
Tarion.
The wizard smiles as Sirius and Remus make their way to the elevator. Remus is quiet only a moment before he leans into Sirius, presses his cheek to Sirius's leather-clad shoulder, and says,
He was flirting with you, you know.
Sirius laughs as the elevator opens and sees them towards the first floor.
Much more likely he's flirting with you, Mooney. Besides, I only have eyes for you.
Remus chuckles as the elevator rises, and the mood seems to fall in tandem with it somehow. His chuckle fades to a forced sort of smile, and Remus pins Sirius with this incredibly forlorn and painful look.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Sirius frowns, his hand going to Remus's waist again.
I know. This is going to... Oh, what's the word the mind healer uses? Trigger. Is this going to upset you? Because I don't.
Oh, you have always been my guard dog, haven't you?
Remus murmurs, leaning his head on Sirius's shoulder once more.
I'll be fine, Pads. I'll be upset, you know. This sucks, but, well, I want to be there for this kid, whoever it is.
Yeah, we'll both be there, all right?
The elevator doors slide open with Sirius's words hanging in the air, and standing there waiting for them is Healer Pringrape, an anxious furrow to her brow. She looks as all business as she sounds, with salt and pepper hair and an elegant chignon and tortoiseshell glasses on her nose.
Mr. Lupin, Mr. Black.
She greets them, then extends a hand to shake.
Thank you for coming on short notice. I'll explain everything through here.
Sirius just nods and hums in the appropriate locations as the healer leads them to a small room. He remembers this ward from when Molly's kid had gotten a bite from a rather ferocious common Welsh dragon whilst out with some friends in the fens. He'd admitted to his Uncle Gideon that he'd been trying to ride the dragon, so it probably had good reason to bite him, but of course he'd never tell his mother that. Molly Pruitt may look sweet, but she's ferocious when crossed. The room is well lit with a desk and several chairs, and a rather large whiteboard that Sirius is sure is more magical than some office organizational tool should be. He ushers Remus into a seat, though Remus looks surprised at the lack of a patient in this room, and sits next to him.
Forgive me, I'm not so sure of etiquette when it comes to lycanthropy victims.
The healer tells them, picking up a thin manila folder.
Please, just be straight to the point. Usually we'd refer to patients as having lycanthropy, though.
Remus says carefully, clearing his throat.
Ah, of course. I mean to say, this little girl, well, the Aurors found her in a muggle house, where we believe she lived with her mother.
Lived?
Sirius has watched too many muggle shows about their crime epidemics to let the past tense use go. Hortensia gives a grim nod, pressing her magenta lips briefly together.
Yes, unfortunately the Aurors found her mother's body in the house. From what I understand from the Auror I've spoken with, the mother was the main target of this werewolf, and the child got caught up in it.
Remus clenches his fingers, laced with Sirius's on the arm of the chair. Sirius can feel him shaking ever so slightly, and he doesn't blame him. Sirius himself feels sick at the idea, knowing what had to have happened in that house. He has seen aftermath in all of its guises. The aftermath of war, of spells and bites, and everything else. It still hurts every time.
Have you caught the person responsible?
Remus asks, with his voice quivering in a way only Sirius can recognize. He knows what he is thinking, but Fenrir Greyback is dead and buried, killed by Remus's hand during the uprising of Voldemort's cronies when Harry was at Hogwarts. Remus had stared into the man's eyes and spat into his face as he died, and people still think Sirius is the vicious one.
You'd have to ask the Auror department, I'm afraid, Mr. Lupin.
Of course.
Sirius glances at Remus, the healer, then that strangely magical whiteboard before he speaks. He's already made the connections. Presumably they need some advice on this situation, and help finding somewhere for this newly diagnosed lycanthropy sufferer to heal and be safe and loved.
So, can we see her? Is she conscious?
Hortensia nods once more, giving a visible swallow.
Yes, she's somewhat conscious, partially sedated, and, well, it's not pretty, I'm afraid.
Remus clears his throat.
Quite. Can we see her, please?
There is silence for a moment. Perhaps the healer isn't expecting them both to take this all in their stride so succinctly, but here they are. She gives a tidy wave of her wand towards the whiteboard, which makes Sirius smile inwardly because he knew it was odd, and it shimmers into a presumably one-way window. The room beyond is dimly lit, but the soft lighting doesn't make it feel any less clinical. The figure in the bed looks so small, with a mass of dirty blonde hair that looks damp from here, but mercifully free of blood. She looks so small and helpless, and Sirius aches, thinking of the time Aurora broke her arm when she was a child. Sirius would do anything to help his godchildren, his nieces and nephews, especially when there was a time the family who lived nearly didn't.
Oh,
Remus stands up, with a noise that makes Sirius reach up to steady him at the elbow, and crosses to the window.
how old is she?
He asks, leaning against the window with a hand on the sill to steady himself. Sirius can almost hear what he's thinking.
Not 5, not 5, not 5.
She's 7.
Hortensia supplies, and Sirius breathes a sigh of relief for them both. Sirius stands up then, crosses the small room to the window, and places his hand on Remus's back. He's warm, like always running hot on the edge of a fever. Sirius rubs his thumb in soothing circles, watching Remus's profile and the profile of the girl in turn. She's awake, pale and drawn. There is a large swath of bandages over her left shoulder, already stained red. Magical wounds don't heal like others. In her other hand, she props open a small paperback book that looks tattered and treasured.
How is she doing?
Remus asks, not taking his eyes from the figure.
All things considered.
Hortensia clears her throat before she answers, then she shuffles some papers.
All things considered, I think she's in shock somewhat. It's all a lot to take in and she seems to be striding through like a niffler in a vault.
Sirius chuckles, a surprised bubble of laughter from his throat, and turns to look at the girl. He does so just in time to see Remus turn on his heel for the door. Sirius gives the healer an apologetic smile, a half shrug that makes the buckles on his jacket jingle pleasantly.
We'll just go and see her. Anything else important I should know?
Just that. Well, both myself and the Aura department are trying to find any family members, and we aren't having much luck.
Hortensia tells him with a sadness in her eyes that makes Sirius sure of her dedication. Sirius just nods, with a grim determination pressing his lips together.
Thank you.
He says, then turns to follow Remus to the room next door. The door is already closed, and Sirius stops and listens for a moment, leaning his shoulder lightly against the door.
I read that when I was your age.
Remus murmurs. Sirius smiles. Of course he would be talking about books.
It was my favorite.
My mum read it to me. She read me all these books. She says she read them when she was my age, so they're a bit old.
The girl replies, smiling a little sadly.
You know, it came out when I was 10. That makes me feel old,
he says, chuckling. Sirius can see him perfectly in his mind, rubbing a hand over his mouth with his cheeks turning pink. Sirius grins, letting them have this moment, Remus to have this moment with his inner child and this blonde girl who needs saving just as he did. It dies down to a brief silence. Perhaps she doesn't know what to say to that.
I'm Remus, what's your name?
Peggy.
She's quiet again. Sirius is reminded of Remus, at 11, in the dormitory, unsure and shy against James and Sirius, who were instant best friends and instant troublemakers. They had decided it was their personal mission to draw Remus out of his shell. Now Remus has taken up that mantle. Sirius slips through the door in that brief moment of almost awkward silence. He gives Remus a little smile and keeps it up as he looks at Peggy. Merlin, she looks tired, and Sirius wants to look after her. Another stray in their pack. Another lost little one looking for a home.
Hi, Sirius.
Remus greets him, holding a hand out as Sirius crosses the room.
This is Peggy. Peggy, this is my partner, Sirius.
Peggy murmurs a little hi, and Sirius wonders if that strange look of awe on her face is something to do with the fact they are two men who are unashamed of being themselves or who they love. In fact, they are ashamed of nothing, not in the least the thing that consumes Remus for one day a month.
Are you from the police?
Peggy asks, letting the book fall closed. It's Fantastic Mr. Fox, and Sirius remembers Remus reading that same book in Hogwarts, well-thumbed and loved.
No, we're from a charity, a group who help people who have been bitten like you.
Remus says, leaning forward to rest his elbows upon his knees.
Like I have too, I have a nasty one of those, but it's very old now.
Peggy's eyes go wide as she looks Remus up and down. Sirius can almost hear her say, "You don't look like a werewolf," but it's true. That's because they aren't. They are people. And Sirius would shout that until his voice went hoarse.
Really?
Peggy asks, with the smallest voice, like a tiny bubble of hope in her throat. Remus's smile is a little tight as he shifts in his seat. Sirius knows it's because of the bite around his ankle, the deep purple one that always aches and makes everything worse. The pain radiates up his leg, and Sirius rubs the flat of his palm over Remus's knee.
Yeah, I got mine when I was 5. From a man who had lost himself to the disease we fight against.
He explains, and Sirius swallows back a laugh. Remus is being incredibly kind to the man he killed, but he speaks the same to the Potter children, the younger ones who don't understand.
Is that what will happen to me?
Peggy asks with wide brown eyes. Remus shifts again, his bite likely sore, but it might be from the subject too, that unfortunate truth. Does Remus know? He had already walked in here before the healer had told Sirius her family were long gone, or uninterested in a child with such an affliction. Sirius wishes he and Remus had gotten much better at legilimency, so he could tell him as much, but Sirius has always valued the solitude of his mind. So Sirius waits, knowing Remus is the one better equipped for this conversation, and watches, carefully heartbroken by it all.
No, not if I have anything to do with it, Peggy. If you'll let me. We have potions and herbs to help, and places for everyone to learn about us.
Remus gives Sirius a soft smile, something searching in his eyes.
Am I saying the right thing?
The nurses. Healers, they came in and explained everything, and I knew. I don't know. It makes sense.
Peggy shrugs one shoulder, then gestures with her book.
The witches was my favorite, but they didn't have that here. So I like witches, and magic and all that.
I haven't read either of those.
Sirius says, wagering Remus knows both books back to front.
Maybe we can read it together. Remus, you can bring your copy of The Witches tomorrow.
Remus smiles, a smile that reaches his eyes for the first time since they stepped through the door.
What do you think, Peggy? That sounds pretty good to me.
I'd like that.
It feels like Sirius blinks, and then they're at their new moon meeting, upstairs in the leaky cauldron now, in the largest room they have, where people hold birthday parties or engagement celebrations. It seems fitting because they celebrate themselves here. They don't hide away. Tom has made sure there's tea and coffee, and James has sent a huge batch of carrot and coriander soup. Too many of them are well below that poverty line, even now. It's illegal to discriminate because of lycanthropy specifically. That took a lot of fighting, but they did it. But that doesn't stop more close-minded employers from finding any excuse they can. This meeting is special, though, because sat next to Sirius, wrapped in a knitted blanket he brought from home and holding a dog stuffy Remus had bought her, is Peggy. Sirius is watching both her and Remus in turn as Remus greets their arrivals. The new moon meetings are usually busier. It welcomes those who weather the full moon themselves, like the small pack of refugees from Norway who live together now in the Dorset moors and have a barn of their own that Remus and Sirius helped make safe for them, or the ones who take wolfsbane and curl up in their bedrooms, or those friends and relatives who want to know all they can about their loved ones' afflictions. And Remus is always happy to teach.
Uncle Padfoot.
Sirius hears, a moment before a red-haired streak runs over to him and wraps her arms around his middle. Florence Potter is the youngest, with hair the color of her mother's, but as wild as her father's. She has a pair of round, sparkly glasses on her nose and grins up at Sirius with a gap in her teeth. She's 11, nearly finished her first year of Hogwarts, and is so full of energy. Sirius is sometimes tired just watching her.
Hello, Poppet.
Sirius kisses her head, then shifts her onto one knee as she reaches over him to hug Remus around the shoulders. James is not far behind his youngest, grinning broadly and greeting everyone on his way over. He'd had the brilliant idea of having Florence meet Peggy, because they were fairly close in age, and Florence was extroverted enough to pull anyone from their shell.
Hey, Flo.
Sirius murmurs, bouncing his knee so she wobbles a little.
This is Peggy. She's my new friend, and she's like Uncle Mooney. Remember how we talked about lycanthropy?
Florence nods, then looks over with wide eyes to where Peggy sits, tired but curious. Florence clambers from Sirius's lap and pads over to Peggy. Her shoes light up, and Peggy's eyes go just as wide, although Sirius has to admit light-up shoes are a pretty cool Muggle invention. With a little grunt, he's getting too old for this, Sirius slides from his chair to sit on the floor beside Florence, looking up at Peggy with a smile.
Peggy, this is Florence. She's James's daughter.
He explains, gesturing to James.
I like your shoes.
Peggy murmurs. She's still quiet, still sore and healing and coming to terms with everything she's ever known being upended in one fell swoop. But she's getting better. Her shoulder isn't far from healed. With the magic from the healers and the potions, salves, and spells, their wide network of witches and wizards are refining to make lycanthropy as easy as possible. Sirius worries about her mind sometimes. Poppy Pomfrey has recommended she see Sasha, a brilliant mind healer who now visits Peggy every other day. And Remus and Sirius are there every day, whether it's for an afternoon or the whole day, one or the other or both. Remus has been steadfast in his assurance that she wouldn't face this alone, even if he lets out warier and warier sighs when he climbs into bed at night.
Try them on.
Florence cries, then drops to sit cross-legged on the floor, pulling the laces of her shoes undone and prying them from her feet.
The insides are purple.
Peggy leans forward, then shrugs off the blanket around her. She has a cardigan Sirius knitted over a dress Lily had sent along, and the bandages over her shoulder just peek out from beneath the neckline of it, though Sirius is sure no one will really notice.
Can I?
She asks, and when Florence gives her an earnest, enthusiastic nod, she slides from her chair too to sit knee to knee with Florence. Sirius smiles, leaning back a little to let the girls talk. Florence has a knack of making anyone comfortable. James had told him how she'd made friends on the Hogwarts Express, and there had been a small disagreement over who would share the boat across the lake between her new friends. James had been proud as punch, and Sirius remembers how quickly they'd become brothers. Speaking of the devil, James catches Sirius's eye across the room and grins just as broad as ever. He quirks his eyebrows, gives a pointed look towards Florence and Peggy, and Sirius rolls his eyes at James's ridiculousness, and the fact Sirius knows exactly what he means by this. They're getting on well, though that was to be expected with Florence. The meeting goes well, as they always do. Florence and Peggy sit at the side, with Florence introducing the younger girl to the travel set of gobstones she'd gotten at Christmas. It's specially designed, a little smaller with a shallow dish to throw them in, and they don't spray you, as much as Florence says that's much less fun. Peggy is taking to the wizarding world remarkably well. Sirius suspects there's magic somewhere in her blood, in some long-lost relative, but he won't know for sure unless some spontaneous accidental magic surprises them all. In the 2 weeks since her bite, Peggy has been slowly learning everything about this world she's now thrust into. Remus has been working closely with the healers to ensure she's supported, and the mind healers to make sure she's taking this all in. Sirius, after a late-night discussion with Remus over tea and leftovers, has been dealing with the Auror department to ensure they find the person responsible for this. Just as James and Remus are updating everyone about the new responsibilities St. Mungo's has to ensure adequate health care to lycanthropy sufferers, Tom appears in the doorway, giving Sirius a look.
Someone for you.
He mouths to Sirius, then gestures to his chest as if indicating a crest.
Oris.
Sirius stands up and slips to the side, as inconspicuously as possible, with a little murmur to Remus. Peggy's wide eyes follow him for a moment, and Sirius gives her a reassuring smile just before he follows Tom from the door.
All right, Tom. No trouble for you, right?
He asks, following the barkeep's quick pace down the hallway.
Fine enough. Mr. Black.
Sirius, please.
He's asked Tom often enough, but it's force of habit for the man. At least he's not doing it solely to poke at Sirius's family lineage, or Sirius would be much less amenable to his propriety.
Right you are.
Tom agrees with a sheepish little smile. Sirius recognizes the Auror waiting to the side of the bar. Thankfully, it's Auror Geach in charge of Peggy's case. He looks somewhat grim, though, so Sirius reckons he isn't bearing good news.
Evening, Mr. Black. Sorry to disturb your meeting.
He greets, and Sirius holds back a sigh. He supposes Mr. Black is the curse of growing old. The gray hair at his temples predisposes him to that kind of title, as much as he still feels like some early 20s whirlwind some days.
No problem, Geach. Tom, can we use the office for a second?
Sirius claps him on the shoulder, then steps to the side to address Tom. He gives a nod, then Sirius indicates to the office.
So, what news?
They are settled in the office, Sirius taking the seat and the Auror leaning against the desk. He's a damn sight younger than Sirius, too, so maybe he's letting the old man have the seat, and that would sting if Sirius didn't feel like growing old was a privilege after all this.
Good and bad. I'm afraid.
Geach gestures with a slim manila folder.
We tracked Dan, Ms. Weatherford's father. Good news is he's a wizard. Bad news. He died during a riot at the U.S. Wizarding Congress 6 years ago.
Sirius grimaces, remembering reading news of that riot in the Prophet. It had been a tough time, not long after the failed uprising of Voldemort's cronies, though the unrest seems to have died down now.
Any other relatives at all?
Not that we've found. No.
The Auror admits after a brief pause, a reluctant grimace flashing over his face beneath the mask of professionalism.
Gila Pringrape tells me she will likely be out of the ward soon. They'll be passing her guardianship to the Muggle Relations team to find a Muggle orphanage.
Sirius's stomach twists again. He's come to care for Peggy, and he won't lie and say seeing Remus reading her The Witches, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the hospital bed with Sirius, knitting and listening serenely, hasn't set his heart aflame with the same kind of fluttering happiness that was seeing Lily cradling Harry that first day, his shock of black hair against her pale skin. He and Remus haven't spoken about it. Sirius doesn't want to bring it up, in case Remus has been thinking something wildly different, or perhaps that he hasn't thought on it at all. But tonight, over the fish and chips they'll get from the great shop in the village, they'll have to talk about it.
Right.
Sirius says, clearing his throat.
Keep me updated, will you? I can reach you at the ministry, I presume.
Yes, Mr. Black, sir.
Geach sits up a bit straighter, and Sirius realizes he might have come off a little sharp there. He forgets so readily that the name Black still carries some weight in this society, even if the rest of his good-for-nothing family went down in flames with the Lestranges and most of the Malfoys. Still, he can be somewhat intimidating, and Sirius hurries to follow it up with a smile. Sirius stands, eager now to get back to the meeting, to sit next to Remus with his hand on Remus's knee, to watch Peggy and Florence play gobstones, to listen to the world they have built thrive. He holds a hand out to the Auror and gives him a softer smile.
Thank you, Geach, for keeping us in the loop.
He murmurs, shaking the man's hand.
Glad to help, sir.
Geach gives him a nod before grasping his wand and disapparating with a sharp twist crack that fills the office. Sirius waits only a moment to breathe deeply before he goes back to the meeting. New moon, new beginnings. Perhaps this was strangely fitting for them all. Comet waits, obedient but cheeky, at Remus's feet in the hopes of quickly stealing any dropped bits of fish or chips. Remus is far too used to the spaniel curled up there to pay her any mind, as he carefully levers a piece of fish onto his fork, glancing sideways to Sirius before he eats.
So what did the Auror say?
Remus asks. They haven't mentioned the Auror's impromptu visit until right now, settled in their cottage with the fire stoked, with 2 steaming cups of tea and a sea's bounty between them. It's been too long between them now, too long of their team of Sirius Remus, Remus Sirius, for them to keep secrets. If Remus needed to know anything, Sirius would tell him, so there's no need to worry. Sirius dunks a forkful of chips into the mushy peas, giving himself a moment to think as he chews.
Good news and bad news.
He says lightly, then takes a sip of his tea.
Peggy's father was a wizard, but he died not long after she was born, if my maths isn't awful.
That earns a snigger from Remus, because Sirius's maths is awful. His arithmancy is passable, but his maths is poor.
And so, well, once she's well enough to leave the hospital, they're passing her to Muggle Relations to find an orphanage or a foster family or something.
Remus promptly chokes on a mouthful of his supper.
Fuck no.
He coughs out, straightening up. Gracie perks up and presses her chin atop his knee to make sure he's well. Sirius scoffs, somewhat surprised at his outburst and a little concerned because he hasn't had to remember a choking charm since Florence was a baby. Sirius pets Gracie, reassuring her that Mooney is fine until Remus speaks up himself.
No, I knew a kid who lived in an orphanage at primary school. No way.
You did?
Sirius pauses to wave his hand towards the record player to turn the vinyl over. That's a charm he's perfected over the years too, so that his wand can stay in his pocket and neither he or Remus need to get up from the sofa. The B-side of A Day at the Races comes on with a hum of static, and Sirius can't help but smile at Somebody to Love. James used to sing that to Lily in the common room at full volume and some Godric awful pitch.
It was dreadful. I felt awful for him even at 8 years old.
Oh, so this was in the Dark Ages.
Sirius teases, shooting him a little smile. Remus's indignant snort makes him laugh too, as he drops his fork and manages to catch a bit of batter that seems to escape as he laughs.
Point stands, though.
Remus murmurs, as Sirius makes a noise of agreement. Silence lies comfortably between them for a moment as they eat, Sirius's legs tucked up onto the sofa, and Remus's knee pressed against his thigh. Sirius has one hand occupied eating his supper, and the other is alternately giving Lancelot ear scratches, rubbing Remus's knee with absent-minded affection, and stopping Salem from running off with a whole side of fish if he got the chance.
So, if she's not going?
Sirius prompts, then gestures vaguely into the space between them with his fork.
Where does she go?
Remus sighs. Perhaps the question is unanswered for a little longer than Sirius expects, as Remus sips his tea, then watches the fire for a moment.
Here.
Sirius watches the flames, scoops Salem out of his warpath towards fish before he answers. He doesn't need to worry that Remus is hiding something from him. They're past that now, so when Sirius looks over and sees Remus's golden brown eyes glinting with the firelight, he sees the truth, sees what the love of his life, his partner in almost everything, truly wants.
I was thinking that...
Sirius admits then, offering it between them. Their domesticity, their open discussions, with the fireplace before them and their pets all around them, settles in his bones. This is where it has all been leading, their strife during the war, nearly losing the Potters, the trauma they dealt with for years after. They are in their cottage, with their animals, with each other, home-knitted blankets, and hot, greasy food. Comfortable conversation, the room filled with the crackle of the fire and rose-tinted with their love for each other.
One more stray for our pack, huh?
Remus's laughter is far softer this time.
You can never say no to a stray.
Neither can you. You love me after all.
I do.
Remus hums, then shifts over to rest his head on Sirius's shoulder. Sirius has finished his supper, so he can latch an arm around Remus's shoulders and press his lips absently to Remus's curls. He should put their plates in the sink and the wrappers in the bin, but he's comfy now with Remus, and they can talk.
A kid? She's 7, but still a kid. That's a little different to another dog, huh?
Sirius observes, watching as Guinevere the tabby cat pads over to the hearth and stretches out her white-socked legs in front of the warm fire.
Yeah, not a baby, but still. She's fitting into wizarding society well enough, and I do worry about her.
Remus murmurs, his voice soft and lilting as they talk easily. Sirius knows just how important this is to Remus, to be the person he needed when he was a child. Hope had done all she could for Remus, but Lyle hadn't been as supportive as Remus had needed. Remus had told Sirius after a bottle of fire whiskey and another of their sleepless nights plotting to destroy the prejudice he has grown up with, that he suspected Lyle had always resented the reminder that his son had become, the concrete proof of his own biases.
I want us to be what you needed when you were a kid.
Sirius says, a soft whisper against Remus's curls.
Damn everything else if that's what you need.
I think so.
Remus pulls back to look at Sirius for a moment, leaving a ghost of a kiss over his shoulder.
It feels like a big deal, like a decision we shouldn't jump into, and yet...
Sirius snickers, his hand from Remus's shoulder reaching up to brush through his hair.
Babe, when have we ever thought things through?
It's true. Their decisions have always been off the bat. The cottage bought on a whim, their whole business sprouted overnight, their relationship made and solidified over a fire like quenching a sword from the forge. Remus bites his lip, leans eagerly into Sirius's touch. It's taken decades, but Sirius can see the thoughts running through his head, see the shapes of them in his irises.
This is someone else's life, though. Someone with her whole life ahead of her, and it needs to be right.
Does it feel right?
Yes.
There isn't a hesitation in Remus's voice, not a moment of it when he's the stubborn, planted one and Sirius is the raging waters. That is something Sirius knows to take seriously, if Remus will pardon the pun. Whenever Remus has a gut feeling, now, not during the war when their guts were tangled up with paranoia and fear, Sirius knows to follow it.
Me too. It feels right.
If she wants it.
Sirius nods at that. The fire gives a sharp crackle snap that makes him lift one hand to float another piece of firewood into the grate. Guinevere doesn't bat an eyelid, lifts her paw to bat at the bark and rolls onto her back with a contented little purr. At the Potter house, shortly after Sirius had left his mother's domain, their cat Periwinkle hated any levitation spells, and Sirius has fond memories of having to do many things by hand, like stocking the fire or grabbing something from a shelf. Else Periwinkle would launch herself at whatever item floated towards her.
Only if she wants.
Sirius adds, his voice feeling a little dark and sharp in his throat. He knows too well that forcing the will of anyone, never mind someone barely old enough to know their own voice well enough to speak it loud, will never end well. Remus knows that too. Isn't all of this about free will, about dignity and humanity and what their inner children need?
Yeah.
Remus breathes, barely a whisper as he nods. He knows Sirius, can see the thoughts like constellations in his gray eyes, just as Sirius can see his like the tree canopy amongst his. Maybe legilimency isn't so important after all, not when they have this. Sirius leans forward, kisses him softly, nips at Remus's lower lip, then delves in again to deepen the kiss. He's breathless with the realization, all of a sudden, that this might be where they go now. This is on the horizon to save a child where they couldn't save themselves. It's a big decision, but Sirius has always made those with his heart, for good or bad. Remus makes a noise into the kiss, wrapping one arm around his shoulders.
Let's do it. Let's talk to her.
Sirius murmurs, dropping another kiss onto Remus's lips before pulling back to give him the most earnest look he can muster.
Let's ask her tomorrow. We can get Gideon to help with an extension on the cottage, a room for her.
Remus has been dropping kisses against Sirius's lips as he talks, excitedly listing everything they could do. Sirius kisses back every time, his hand rubbing gently over Remus's side.
If she's a witch, she can go to Hogwarts, and if not, Muggle school. She'll be looked after, a safe place to have the moons. She won't be misunderstood or forced to do anything. No molds to fit into, no expectations or disappointments.
Sirius says, kissing between every few words. He feels unexpectedly emotional, teary in a way he wouldn't have foreseen, but he swallows back the tightness in his throat.
She'll have a home here if she wants it, just as she is.
Remus surges forward then, wrapping both arms around Sirius, kissing him hard and sending their empty plates clattering to the floor. Sirius lets out a watery laugh as he holds Remus close, barely able to breathe with every feeling unfettered and blooming around them. Sirius is uncharacteristically nervous as he and Remus stand in the elevator up to the ward. By now they're friends with most of the reception staff because they're there almost every day, and Terrion is still smiling shyly at them both, and they still argue over who he's flirting with. Sirius hadn't smiled so broadly today, and neither had Remus. Remus is rubbing nervously at his stubble, as he tends to do, and Sirius plucks up his hand and kisses his knuckles.
What if she doesn't want to?
Remus says, so softly Sirius wouldn't hear him otherwise. In his other hand there's a bag, with another Roald Dahl book, and some more clothes Lily has passed on from the Potter brood. The elevator slides open, as if eagerly shoving them out of their conversation and into the decision to be made, vicious in its anthropomorphic glee. Sirius pulls Remus to one side, out of the autopilot they've come to inhabit towards Peggy's room. He has no intention of rushing in here, as much as the nervous energy between them dictates it so.
Then we support her, wherever she wants to go.
He mutters softly, leaning in to kiss Remus's temple, still holding his hand. Remus lets out a sigh, his eyes closing.
Yeah, we keep in touch if she wants.
Of course, babe.
Sirius kisses his forehead this time, giving a sigh of his own.
We'll make it all right, no matter what.
That seems enough for them to peel apart just enough to take that autopilot line to Peggy's room. Yesterday had been spent making what preparations they could without going overboard. Sirius called James and met him at Lily's room in Hogwarts, because she was the most level-headed of them all. She agreed it was the best option, if Peggy wanted, and began compiling a list of things they might need, told them to see if Gideon could help with a second bedroom, and told James where the bag of outgrown children's clothes were. Sirius had barely slept last night, sitting up instead and going over the third iteration of the Wolfsbane protocols they're going to take to the Wizengamot next month, with Remus sleeping next to him and Comet squished between them. They go to Healer Pringrape's office first, where she peers over her tortoiseshell glasses at them with much more warmth than that first time. It's routine, soothing, and familiar, as she talks over the progress of Peggy's bite wound, what the mind healer had shared about her mental state. Night terrors are to be expected, she tells them, and the psychological scars will take far longer to heal. That doesn't dissuade Sirius, though, because he knows night terrors as a child, and Remus gives him a sharp nod to confirm he feels the same as they go towards Peggy's room. Peggy is sitting up in bed when Remus pushes the door open with a notebook open in her lap. Her lips split into a grin, and Sirius immediately notices the space in her lower gums where an incredibly wobbly tooth sat yesterday.
Moony. Padfoot.
She calls. Sirius can't help but smile at the way she greeted them.
Hi, Peggy.
Remus says then, going over to the bed and slipping the bag from his shoulder.
Hey, your tooth fell out. Did you get a peppermint pixie or a sickle under your pillow from Cadmus?
Sirius grinned, remembering how excited the Potter kids were to check under their pillow. James was always too excited and used to give them a pixie and a sickle, and if they were ever staying with their uncles, Sirius would do the same.
Yeah.
Peggy picks up the empty paper wrapper of a peppermint pixie, proud to show it off. She's no longer dressed in hospital robes. The bite on her shoulder is healed. Angry and red, yes, but healed. And she's holding herself better the longer it goes on.
Muggles call him the Tooth Fairy.
Remus muses, topping up the glass of water on the bedside with a quick aguamenti. Peggy pouts.
Cadmus makes more sense. Sasha told me the story yesterday.
She announces, in the steadfast, knowledgeable way all 7-year-olds tend to offer their opinion. When Peggy lets the peppermint pixie wrapper go to pick up her crayon, Sirius isn't sure if it's a trick of the light, but does the wrapper float for a moment too long? She doesn't seem to notice, and Remus doesn't either, as he's caught up with the book, nervously unpacking. Sirius tries to catch his eye to say, "Did you see that?" But he doesn't, and even as a pure blood whose magic is wound into his bones, the flutter of it he feels is negligible enough to pass off as an aberration.
What are you drawing, Pegs?
Remus asks, then absently plucks up the empty pixie wrapper to throw into the bin. Peggy has been drawing a lot, Hortensia told them, and there is already a stack of torn-out notebook pages on the table.
Lots.
She tells him, peering up through her dirty blonde hair before she pushes it aside.
This one is me and Sasha, and this one is a unicorn and a dragon and their friends, and this one is me and a dragon, and this one.
Remus is leaning over, eager and interested to watch as she flicks through the sheaf of papers announcing every one. Every one is oriented the right way, and she doesn't fumble with any of the papers. And Sirius wonders if he's thinking too much on it now, if he's seeing wishful thinking and accidental magic.
Those are amazing, Peggy.
Sirius murmurs, one hand on Remus's shoulder as he peers over those errant curls.
That dragon is very cool. It looks like a Chinese fireball.
Peggy waves a hand to shush Sirius, proudly presenting a final sheet of paper to them both.
This one is my favorite,
she announces. Sirius feels Remus tense up a little beneath his hand, hears the little hitch of his breath, and he can see why. It's a family portrait of sorts, with Peggy proudly in the middle, wearing the cardigan Sirius had brought her that first time. Its distinctive zigzag pattern is immediately obvious. Next to her is a little dog, then 3 cats and 4 more dogs. Sirius recognizes the latter as their own pets, whom he'd told Peggy about a lot. He wonders briefly if she had a dog when she lived with her mum, but is more distracted by the two figures beside Stick Peggy. One is tall with black hair and a black jacket. The other is a little shorter, a brown scribble of hair and a maroon-looking top. Sirius's breath catches in his throat a little. Then, there is a scruffy black dog and a fluffy brown dog. It's Padfoot and Mooney, and that means the little tan-colored dog next to Peggy is her own lycanthropic form. Remus sniffs slightly. The sun is in the sky above a brown-colored house, with lots of grass and flowers surrounding it.
Who's that, Peggy?
Sirius asks with his heart in his throat, pointing a finger towards the figure beside the sun, with a big smile and a halo of blonde hair. It seems like a stupid question as soon as it's out of his mouth, but he's sort of stunned by it all.
That's Mum. She's an angel looking after us.
Peggy says, as if she's thoroughly unaware of the gut punch she's dealt both he and Remus. Remus's hand reaches up to clasp Sirius's on his shoulder.
And all the animals?
Peggy gives him the 7-year-old version of a withering look, as if it's a silly question too, because this is her family portrait after all.
That's Padfoot and Mooney, and then Salem, and I don't remember her name, Gwen, Jen, and Freya. And then Lancelot and Comet and Gracie and Cersei. And this one is me. But I don't know if I'm this color, so I picked my hair color, but I can change it.
Oh, Peggy.
Remus breathes, his voice sounding thin.
That's lovely, sweetheart.
Sirius says, giving Remus's fingers a reassuring squeeze, though he feels on the edge of tears himself. Peggy smiles her toothy grin, blinking those wide eyes at Sirius, and his heart gives a little tug because it will kill them both to let her go to some Muggle foster home. She pouts then, looking back at her drawing with the eye of an art critic.
I didn't have the right color for my cardigan.
Sirius sighs, hoping to Merlin and Morgana that she will want to stay with them, that this family picture is a good omen of something.
Well, we have lots of crayons at our house.
Remus glances up at him, with tears shining in his brown eyes, but a smile as broad as Sirius has ever seen across his lips. Sirius can't resist pressing a kiss to the top of his head as he speaks.
And the healer says soon you won't need to stay here.
Remus's voice is gentle, and Sirius is watching Peggy for every minutia feeling across her face. Her eyes widen a little, her brows pitch up.
So we were thinking if you wanted to come and stay with us, we'd love to have you.
Yeah.
Peggy cries, throwing her arms up. Peggy has insisted on bringing her family portrait with her, folded carefully into the little bag she has, with some crayons in her current reed, the BFG. She is excitedly bouncing on the heels of her light-up shoes, the ones James got her after both she and Florence wouldn't stop talking about them. Sirius, however, is nervous as they take the elevator down to reception. The portkey James had set up for use on full moon nights is kept securely with the rest of the specific portkeys at reception, so they are heading there. Sirius didn't want to risk any mishaps with the flu network, especially with the slight speech impediment Peggy's new gap in her teeth created. Mispronunciation is more trouble than it's worth, to be sure, and it hadn't even been a consideration for either man to choose between them. Remus is nervous too, or perhaps still dealing with the emotional tidal wave of the drawing in Peggy's bag, so Sirius talks as they go.
A portkey is like a door, and all we have to do is touch it, and the door opens up right at our house.
He explains, looking down at Peggy, who is standing between them holding Remus's hand like it's no big deal. Perhaps it isn't, though. Maybe this is just how things are meant to be.
Wow. That sounds so cool. Can we go anywhere?
Remus chuckles as the doors open, Peggy skipping along excitedly with her hand still clasped in his.
Not quite. Doors only go one place, don't they? So this one only goes to our house.
Peggy nods, her lips pressed together in determination. Sirius ruffles her hair as she pops onto her toes to peer over the reception desk.
Hi.
She tells the reception staff in a little voice.
Hello, dear.
The witch on reception is just as cheery, giving her a broad smile before she looks up to Sirius and Remus.
How can I help you?
Could we get the Moonlight Mile portkey, please? Care of James Potter.
Sirius asks, giving her a smile himself. His heart is hammering nervously, but every thump just reinforces how right this feels.
Of course, Dears, follow me.
The port key room is full of well-spaced shelves, and the witch leads them succinctly to the one marked for them. It's an old Muggle phone book, with yellowing, curled corners, and the witch stands to the side.
On 3, Peggy.
Remus says softly, but he keeps a tight hold on Peggy's hand just in case she's a second out.
It might make you feel a bit sick, okay?
Peggy nods, then hooks her arm through her bag and takes Sirius's hand with her other one. Sirius counts down, reaching out to touch the phone book a moment before the uncomfortable jolt settles behind his navel and pulls him through the magic of it to spill out by the alder tree. He still has a tight hold on Peggy's hand, catching her as they land, his other hand going to the bark of the tree for stability.
All right.
He asks, both to Peggy and Remus, who largely hates traveling by portkey but needs must. Remus nods, letting out a slow breath as he looks down to Peggy.
Oh, that was funny.
Peggy whispers, her eyes wide. She's a little pale, but nothing awful. Sirius isn't too worried. Merlin knows she's made of tougher stuff.
It's horrid the first time.
Sirius agrees, looking out to the garden. The early morning frost on the grass has melted, and the tentative spring sun is leaving striations over the lawn and the gingerly sprouting flower beds. Beyond the thick panes of glass and into the cottage, Sirius can see the firelight of the hearth and that one light in the hallway that they always leave on. That's a Muggle habit too, one that Hope passed on along with her knitting. Sirius is excited to show Peggy everything here, for her to meet the dogs and cats and start to wonder if this is a place she could call home.
Shall we go inside?
Peggy turns and peers at the cottage, trying to take it all in. It's a little colder up north here, but Peggy has her cardigan and is buzzing with excitement.
It's so pretty,
she cries, starting up the stone path towards the front door. She stops, though, a few steps in and tilts her head to the side.
And
What's wrong?
Remus asks, giving Sirius a worried, wide-eyed look with his hand still in Peggy's.
I colored the house the wrong color in my picture.
Sirius lets out a little chuckle, relieved as Peggy digs in her bag for her picture, looking disgruntled that she'd gotten it wrong. It hadn't even occurred to Sirius that the house in her picture was theirs, despite it being them and their pets. And even if he had, he's not going to correct a 7-year-old on her use of color. Remus smiles, resting his hand carefully on her shoulder, protective and reassuring, and oddly proud. Sirius can't help but grin watching them for a moment, like some final frame of a Muggle movie before the credits roll with that happy ending.
That's okay, we have colors in the house.
Remus says, as Peggy pulls out her drawing with a triumphant flourish.
I can change it.
Peggy looks at the cottage, then back to her drawing. The flare of magic Sirius feels is far stronger now, strong enough to make his own flare in symbiosis, like some diluted version of what it does whenever Remus casts. Sirius feels that in his bones. But this, it's too strong to ignore, and the effect of it is immediately obvious. The house in Peggy's drawings is now gray flagstone, with a dark slate roof and the red-painted windowsills of their cottage. Peggy makes a pleased little noise, apparently unaware of her unintentional magic, and holds the picture out in front of her.
Better.
She confirms, then starts up the path with her light-up shoes making the slight sheen of the cobbles glitter.
Holy fuck.
Remus breathes, the corners of his mouth plucking up into a smile as he looks at Sirius.
That was...
Yep.
Sirius puts his arm around Remus's shoulder, feeling almost delirious with hope and promise and excitement.
No wonder she's taking well to it all.
Remus leans in, kisses Sirius's cheek.
It's going to be a wild ride, isn't it?
Would we have it any other way?
Sirius retorts, grinning as he gives Remus a look that can't be anything other than filled with love.
Never.
Puppy.
Peggy shouts, and Sirius looks over to see her on her toes once more, peering through the window into the hallway. Gracie has her front paws on the inside sill, sniffing eagerly at the visitor. It's a whirlwind then, as they step into the cottage, and all the pets hurry over to greet Peggy with eager licks or rubs or some more tentative sniffs. Sirius feels something unlatch in his chest, a buckle he hadn't realized had tightened until it loosens now. They have so much to do, so much ahead of them for all of them. But they will do it. They will grow and learn, and it will be hard, but it will be worth it. Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora.